We are now days away from Germany's next major elections, which are the local elections to be held in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. With a population of around 18 million, this is the largest federal state in Germany by population. And these elections will determine the composition of the local city councils in the various cities and towns throughout the state. Now, this election will have more attention and focus than in normal local elections because, once again, this is the biggest state in the country, and also due to the fact that the federal elections were held early, there are no major elections happening right now in Germany, and so this is kind of seen as a bellwether to check the popularity of the federal government after we had the federal elections back early in the February of this year. Now, if we take a look at the previous results from 2020, we can see the CDU came first with around 34% of the vote, the SPD in second with 24%, and the Greens surged in this election, coming in a strong third with around 20% of the vote. The FDP and the AFD won around 5%, and then the association of various local political parties won 5%, around 5% as well. Die Linke, which has some strongholds in the urban areas of the state, won 4% back in 2020. The federal elections are held every 4 years, but the state and local elections in most areas are held every 5 years. So we had the previous ones in 2020. If we take a look at the polls for this election, there aren't many polls, and there's a number of reasons for this. Is that this is not a really local election for the entire state. This is an election for individual cities. Some cities are going to have parties that are perform, based off of the popularity of the party themselves. In some areas, you're going to have candidates that are very strong. In other areas, you're going to have independent political parties, voter associations, or mayoral candidates that aren't affiliated with any party that kind of mess with the numbers some. And so it's very hard to get accurate polling on this in a similar way that you would have for a state or federal election. But we can take a look at the overall trend here from the latest polls we have. Probably the most accurate one will be this latest INSA poll. We can see that the CDU is roughly in line with what they got in the last election, one putting them at 32, one putting them at 36. And so this shows that they're basically in line with what they got in the previous election. The SPD is about the same, maybe a point below, but the two main parties are going to probably get the same amount of votes in this election that they did in the last election. The main difference here is we see a collapse of the support for the Greens and a rise in support for the AFD. This makes a lot of sense because this election was held in 2020 during COVID. The Greens at that time were still very strong, and the AFD was really struggling to gain a footing. During COVID, in the initial months, the AFD had a difficult time on getting a platform, getting their position on some of the COVID era politics. And so it was not until November of 2022 that they started to recover and surge. And so if we take a look at these polls, we see the Greens are expected to lose anywhere from a quarter to half of their support throughout this state. And the AFD is expected to triple in support, but this is a state where the AFD hasn't done super well. So tripling is going from 5 to 15% increase for around 10 points. And that could put them in a third place position in these state elections. Die Linke, which have been struggling for political survival over the past several years, is expected to maintain their representation. And in a lot of these cities, there is no 5% threshold. So even if Die Linke or another party gets around, 1 to 2%, as long as they get a few percentage points in each, city or in any given city, they will win seats for those district or city councils. The BSV is pulling around 2 or 3%. And like I said, even though they're not 5% here, they will likely be able to win a few city council seats here and there. We also have polls on different cities. Now, the state of North Rhine-Westphalia is somewhat of a stronghold for both the CDU and the SPD. The rural areas of the state, the Rhineland, are very traditional conservative Catholic areas that have voted for the CDU and its predecessor, the Center Party, for well over a century now. However, the industrial urban centers in the Ruhr Valley, the Ruhrpott, are strongholds for the SPD. And that's why this state has been a place where the traditional parties have succeeded, whereas the other parties such as the Greens, the FDP, the AFD, Die Linke have kind of struggled to gain a major footing in the double digits, with a few exceptions. We take a look at Dortmund, for example. This is an industrial city in the Ruhr Valley, and the SPD is polling in first place as to be expected. Bonn is a more university city that is near some of the rural areas. Of course, it has a large student population. We have the Greens in first place as they won this city in the last election, and then the CDU is in a strong second place because you have a lot of middle class voters who support more liberal conservative politics, whereas in the major cities you have a divide between the SPD, and then the Greens and CDU are a little bit behind them. Dusseldorf, the state capital, is expected to go towards the CDU, with the Greens losing some support, but a general overall break between various political parties. We have Cologne, which is the largest city in the state of around 1 million people, the fourth largest city in the country. This was a stronghold for the Greens. It still is. They're expected to win it by a few points, but definitely less than they did in the previous election. We have Munster, which is also a stronghold, a big university city for the Greens with a large student population, and this will be a kind of close, tight race between the CDU and the Greens. Now, there's not polling for all the cities, but I want to take a look at the map from the previous federal election that we had back in February to get an idea. Now, this is very difficult to see because it doesn't break down every single village, but if we take a look, we can see most of the state is colored in black for the CDU. Most of the rural areas and the suburban areas went for the CDU and probably will go to them for this election. And then we have the university student-heavy cities, Aachen, Cologne, Münster, also Bonn. Those will likely be contested by the Greens. And then there's the industrial area where you have the SPD, which was, until now, the main dominant force there. And a lot of these cities, Bochum, Essen, Dortmund, will go to the SPD. But we also see the AfD was able to gain a footing here. They actually won the most votes for the second vote in the city of Gelsenkirchen, and I believe came in a strong second in Essen and in Recklinghausen. So it is very likely that the AfD will have a strong showing in the Ruhr Valley. So if we take a look at the map, we can kind of see that the rural areas will be between, dominated by the CDU with probably the AfD and Greens vying for second, and then the more urban areas will be dominated by the SPD with either the AfD, Greens, or CDU coming in a strong second there. Now, one story I want to talk about is relating to this local election that has kind of caused a stir about it is we've had an incident where a number of local AfD candidates have died in the run-up to this election. Now, this is not unusual to happen because, of course, these local elections are for various small city, town councils. You're going to have hundreds of candidates because, even small towns with a population of 10, 20,000 are going to have maybe a 30-seat council, and then you have maybe 6 to 10 parties, each with a candidate. And so a lot of these local elections have hundreds, even thousands of candidates. And many of these candidates might be very older, might be local people that have lived in the town for a while. And if you have older candidates, it's not unusual for someone to die before you have the election. However, we had an incident where a number of AfD candidates died in a period of a few weeks, and it seemed to be odd because the number of AfD candidates that had died seemed to be an anomaly compared to the number of candidates that die from other parties. There hasn't been too much more developments on it. Of course, some people are speculating about things, and there hasn't been really a clear understanding of what's happening. Some people are saying that this is from the government are saying that this is normal, that this happens, and that there's no major anomalies. But some people are saying that statistically this is very unlikely to happen, that one party has so many people that die. A few of the candidates, I believe, were older in their 70s or 80s, but a few of them that died were younger. So we don't really have an understanding of what happened here, but this was kind of a story that caused a lot of attention in the past few weeks for these elections. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is something that actually happened a few hours ago today, and that was that the French government has collapsed. This is the government under Prime Minister Bayrou, a liberal who is an ally of Emmanuel Macron. Now, of course, since the snap elections, we've had a fragmented French National Assembly, and because of that, it's been very hard to have a stable government in the country. And so this kind of came not as a surprise to really anyone. There's been many collapsed governments in France over the past few years, and this is, the latest example of that. And I want to just take another look at the French National Assembly. We can see that the government parties have around 210 seats in the opposition. That is the right-wing National Rally, the various left-wing parties, and some of the conservatives have around 364 seats. And so we see that for the kind of minority liberal government led by Macron's allies, it's very difficult for them. And they've attempted to either work with the center-right conservatives, but that group has fragmented, with some going to Macron and some going to Le Pen's National Rally. And then they've tried also to work with some of the socialist and Greens within the left-wing group, but they have kind of somewhat held together and decided not to, split off into individual left-wing parties and work with Macron's group. And so that means it is very difficult because the liberal bloc within the French National Assembly doesn't have an outright majority, and they can't really find allies on the left or right. They have to rely on these minority governments. Whenever the National Rally or one of the left-wing groups doesn't like, for example, a budget proposal, what they can do is initiate a vote of no confidence, where they can just basically bring down the government. And so we have a very unstable situation in the country. And this is something that is, like I said, not too surprising. I will probably do some more updates on it in the future once we get a new prime minister. And if there's any, electoral, if this causes maybe a new snap election, of course, we had the last legislative elections a year ago. It's possible that we could have Macron call for new legislative elections eventually. And so if we have anything like that, we'll of course cover it. But we will have the local elections in Germany in a few days, and I'll make a video on that. There hasn't been too much happening politically as much as there was in the last summer with the EU elections, the British, the French snap elections. And so that's why I haven't been making as many videos. But I do want to cover this situation. Like I said, once we have the local election results on Sunday and Monday, I will do another video then. So that's going to be it for this video. Hope you all like it. Please do like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.